And we are back on the Zero Hour. Joining us now is George Zornick, who does a lot of great writing for The Nation on politics, on the economy, on Wall Street, and a number of other subjects. I read him. You should too. I also just found out that he, like me, is an upstate New Yorker. He's from Buffalo. I'm from Utica. I don't know about you, George, but I live somewhere else now. In any event, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. Yeah, I live down in D.C., but miss upstate all the time.
Do you ever get up there?
I actually keep my Bill season tickets, so I get up probably more than I should.
Well, that's good. We didn't have the Bills in Utica.
But you have the Distance Running Hall of Fame, which is an interesting attraction.
Oh, we used to have the Utica Club Brewery. We used to have the Wonder Bread Factory. Well, we used to have a lot of things when I was growing up that we don't have anymore because, of course, the Rust Belt's been decimated. I went back to Utica for the first time and wrote about it. It is absolutely decimated by our manufacturing policies. But that is not what we're here to talk about. And they are feisty there, and they're going to come back. But we have a lot of things I would love to talk to you about because you've been writing on a number of great subjects, including, of course, the election is coming up. But I got to start with this one because I think it's going to be a lot of interest to our listeners, and it certainly is to me. You had the eagle eye to spot an Elizabeth Warren interview in People magazine. Either that or you were in the dentist's office, and that's where you saw it. But one way or another, you found an Elizabeth Warren interview in Politico where she seemed to open the door to running for president. Is that a fair interpretation?
It definitely is. You know, she's been asked hundreds and literally hundreds of times if she's going to run for president, and every time she has given an unequivocal answer that she absolutely will not. She said, "Do you want me to put an exclamation point on the end of that? I am not running for president." This time she was asked, and she said, "I don't think so." And then she said, "If there's any lesson I've learned in the past 5 years, it's don't be so sure about what lies ahead. There are some amazing doors that could open." So you know, as someone who follows politics, that is kind of the vernacular of someone who is flirting with a run. I mean, they choose their words pretty carefully. Now, Warren's office did get back to me and say, no, nothing has changed. And it certainly is possible that because she was talking to a non-political reporter, maybe she just was a little more loose with her language than she would have been. But the way I read it and the way a lot of folks read it is that she's thinking about it.
And I wanted to ask you about that response from her press secretary, because even nothing has changed is not as unequivocal. If that was the sum total of her response, her press secretary's response, that's not as unequivocal as they might have been either. She could have said, no, she is absolutely not running for president. And she didn't say that, right?
Correct. It was a one-sentence email, and it said nothing has changed. You know, I think that she has an interest in tamping down the speculation for now, because if she does end up running, I don't think she wants to be painted as someone who, you know, is basically running from the moment she got in the Senate, and she wants people, I think, to take her Senate work right now seriously as a serious effort to get things done instead of, you know, kind of imaging for a presidential campaign. So I understand that why they wanted to keep the speculation down, but at some point they would have to shift, and I wonder, I'm not sure, but I wonder if this is that shift starting to happen.
And why do you think that might be? Let's chat about politics for a second. Why would she choose this particular moment, if in fact she did? And as you say, it might have been spontaneous, or it might have been any number of things. But assuming that she might be letting up a little bit on the denials, what about this moment strikes you as a reason why she might do that?
Well, you know, at some point she was going to have to, and recall that Hillary Clinton has been a little bit coy about her timeline, but has basically been telegraphing that sometime early next year, or even possibly at the end of this year, around December, she will formally declare for president. And so at some point, the people who are running against her have to start at least moving in that direction. You know, you have to have a campaign infrastructure and staff, you have to start talking to donors, you have to get it in voters' minds before they you know, become too interested in another candidate that, hey, you might be out there. So this is about the time when, if she was going to make a move, that she would start to do it.
Now, we're talking politics with writer George Zornick, and I don't know if you noticed this, George, and I don't want to throw you off guard, but this came out a couple days ago, yesterday, I believe it was, or possibly the day before. Hillary Clinton seemed to change her tone a little bit too. She was up in Minnesota, stumping for Al Franken, and according to reports, including one in Politico, she struck an anti-Wall Street tone. And obviously, Hillary Clinton is more associated with Wall Street than any other potential Democratic presidential nominee, at least in the public mind. There are a lot of associations between Bill Clinton and the hedge funds and so on, and the deregulation era under President Clinton. Now Hillary, for the first time, seems to be striking a slightly more populist tone about Wall Street. One is tempted, and by one is tempted, I mean I am tempted to wonder if there isn't any connection between the looming specter of Elizabeth Warren, the populist out there, and a possibility of slightly more populist tone from Hillary Clinton.
I would not be surprised at all. I have no informed reporting on what's going on inside Hillary Clinton's camp, but it would be sheer political malpractice if they were not concerned about, number one, her image among voters as far as coziness to Wall Street and the big banks goes, Elizabeth Warren or not, and number two, that they should be very closely following what Warren is saying and doing. You know, it would just be insane if they weren't, because she represents most likely the biggest potential threat to a Hillary Clinton candidacy. I mean, you can argue whether Warren would ever win or have a chance of winning, and maybe she wouldn't, but there's no question in my mind that people inside Hillary's camp are watching that. And that was, you know, she has talked kind of glancingly or sometimes directly about income inequality, but going after banks in particular was a little bit of a new note from her, at least in recent months.
Yeah, and if you remember when Obama made rhetorical feints against Wall Street, which was primarily what they were, it was Bill Clinton who stood up and said, "Let's not demonize hedge funders," and so on. Cory Booker and some others did as well, but it was Bill Clinton who basically tweaked Obama for using anti-Wall Street rhetoric. So to me, it's a significant thing. It's a significant political shift to see Hillary Clinton diss Wall Street at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Bill Clinton even continues. A couple weeks ago, he did an interview with CNBC where the interviewer asked him, "Do you think that companies who are sheltering their taxes in the Virgin Islands or wherever are being unpatriotic?" Because, of course, that's the line from Obama on down to top Senate Democrats that's been being pushed, that these countries are acting unpatriotically and not paying their taxes. And Bill Clinton said, no, and he went on this long kind of dissertation about why the companies were acting in their best interest, and sure, maybe the tax law should be changed, but they're not. You know, he kind of threw a wet blanket on the unpatriotic talk. So she has a problem there. I mean, as you mentioned, the Bill Clinton administration, engaged in a lot of Wall Street deregulation, most notably, of course, the Glass-Steagall bill. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword for Hillary, because she clearly and very consciously wants to remind people of Bill's administration. She frequently harkens back to the good times that were had in the 90s, and no doubt Bill will be and is a valuable campaign surrogate for her. But you can't have it both ways. You can't go out and talk about how great the economy was and all the great things Bill Clinton did without also including, by the way, getting rid of Glass-Steagall and the welfare reform and things like that. So it's going to be a problem for her.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic for me because looking at the Democratic Party and the base of the Democratic Party, it strikes me that the Democratic base loves Bill Clinton. So in that sense, he's a great resource for her. I mean, he's an incredible speaker and campaigner and so on. And yet they really, and I'm speaking of core Democratic voters, once they understand his opinions, the opinions themselves, his views, especially on economic issues, I would say are probably unpopular with Democrats, including he pushed very hard for the Simpson-Bowles deficit reduction plan, which was economically disastrous kind of neoliberalism, in my opinion. He was talking up Social Security cuts. There were reports, not necessarily confirmed, but pretty solid reports that he and Newt Gingrich were looking at additional Social Security cuts. So his views and he expresses his views without hesitation, it seems. His economic views may be a problem for her at the same time that his popularity is clearly central to her strategy.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of what he's been doing since being out of office is raising money for the Clinton Global Initiative, which does a lot of very worthwhile things, but is also, he raises a lot of that money from Wall Street and the private equity folks and things like that. And you're right, he is a very good campaigner, but recall back in 2008, and I'm sure you remember, although most people have forgotten now, he became a real liability for Hillary when things got rough with Obama, when it became a tight race. You remember Bill was lashing out at reporters. He was saying things that some people interpreted to be sort of racially tinged remarks. And there was a while there where the story was, wow, Bill Clinton is really hurting Hillary more than helping her. Now, maybe that won't be repeated again, but there is a bit of mythology around his supposedly awesome campaign skills.
Well, that's a fair point, and I take your point. We're talking with George Zornick of The Nation. I guess I would say to that, my impression at the time was that there was an element in that of what people in 12-step programs describe as self-will run riot, in the sense that Bill, it seemed as if he didn't anticipate that he would receive resistance, least of all from Democrats, and that he was just furious at the idea of his desired outcome being thwarted, and kind of lost it. So one does wonder whether, if someone else were to present a challenge, whether he would be able to restrain himself at that point.
Yeah, it would be interesting to watch, and particularly where he's situated. I mean, it wasn't clear to me, and he probably didn't have any particular problem with Obama or his policies, other than the fact that they stood in Hillary's way. But with Elizabeth Warren, you have someone potentially who not only stands in her way, but is sort of a threat to the Bill Clinton, hedge fund world, Democratic Leadership Council sort of worldview.
Right, and that's a great point, because I think it was understood more by insiders than by the public itself, including voters, that Obama would in fact govern more or less in the same line and use a lot of the same people. So it was strictly personal in that case. But you're right; it would be policy. It would be a policy challenge from someone like Warren as well. And by the way, we're going to have to go to break in a second, and we'll be back with more from George Zornick of The Nation, and maybe we'll switch to Republicans. But I will also observe, I think I wrote about it at the time, that when Bill Clinton started referring to Obama as that kid, implying that he was too young and to be president, Obama was 3 years older than Bill Clinton was when he ran successfully for president. So it would be interesting to see what might happen with a Warren-Hillary matchup. But we will be back with more on the political situation from George Zornick, who writes for The Nation and has been published in many other illustrious places as well. We will be right, and an upstater like me, and like our producer, Pete Callahan. We will be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on The Zero Hour. This is Richard RJ Eskow, and we are talking with George Zornick, writer on politics, the economy, and all sorts of interesting things for The Nation and elsewhere. Fellow upstater in New York, guy I read. You should read him too. George, let's switch now. We've been talking about the Democrats and the 2016 race. Let's talk a little bit about the races that are coming up next month, and particularly the Republicans. Let's pivot a little bit and talk about, for example, Mitch McConnell. I was very surprised by your reporting, which of course originally sourced from Kentucky, that Mitch McConnell actually was improvident, arguably unwise or improvident enough to bring up his attempts to privatize Social Security. Now, that context, a lot of Republicans are trying to run from their Social Security record and, in fact, are attacking Democrats who voted for various compromise, quote unquote, proposals. So that might cut Social Security. So surprising development from the Senate Minority Leader looking to get reelected and become Majority Leader. What do you think was behind that?
Forced error on his behalf. The full context of the remarks was that someone had asked him about gridlock, which is, of course, a big hit against McConnell in this race, that he's kind of shut down the Senate and so on, and that, he was talking about that, and he was talking about his efforts to reach across the aisle, and he said, "Oh yeah, by the way, when George Bush wanted to privatize Social Security, of course he said fix Social Security. I went out and I was desperately trying to reach across the aisle to all these Democrats to get them to come along. I even asked Joe Lieberman, and he wouldn't come along with me." And then he moved on to his broader point about how he's tried to reach across the aisle. But that is a particularly ugly chapter to bring up. It's something he was very involved in. He was the majority whip at the time in the Senate, and that plan was so unpopular that the Republicans never even brought it up to a vote. And basically since then, it's been more or less politically toxic. Paul Ryan did put it in some of his earlier budgets, but as soon as the Republicans took the House and there was a chance that these budgets would be passed, he took it out of the budget immediately. So for McConnell to bring that up was surprising, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if Allison Lundergan Grimes people aren't cutting that up into a campaign ad as we speak.
If they're not, it would be political malpractice on their part. And just history for our listeners, if they don't remember, Republicans were talking about doing that, tried to do that in 2005. Democrats took the House in 2006. Obama made it part of his deficit reduction commission and talked a lot about it in 2009, 2010. Democrats lost the House in 2010 while Republicans ran on a seniors Bill of Rights, so-called. There is no penalty for hypocrisy in American politics. So Mitch made a mistake. We'll see how that affects that race. And meanwhile, the other area of elision, or whatever word you want to use, on the Republican side, they're all attacking President Obama for not being aggressive enough in the ISIL situation, and yet presumably the only way he could be more aggressive is by putting boots on the ground. Now, apparently they're having difficulty, at least I think the example you used was, I can't remember if it was Gardner or one of the other candidates, but they have a tough time answering questions about exactly how tough they'd be and would they put boots on the ground, right?
Yeah, exactly. These guys like Gardner in Colorado and Tillis in North Carolina, Perdue in Georgia, they'll hammer Obama for being indecisive and for not acting more aggressively. But when you ask them particularly, which a lot of debate moderators and which their opponents have, would you put troops on the ground? It's almost comical to watch the sort of sidestepping and dancing they do, because they absolutely do not want to say that they will. Of course, that's a very unpopular position to take. So it's funny to see them, on the one hand, criticizing Obama for indecision, and then someone says, "Okay, would you do this?" and they immediately can't get nailed down on it. So yeah, I think it's a fair question to ask all, not just boots on the ground, but ask all these candidates. What would you do? Because this is a very complicated and fluid situation. What specifically would you do differently than what Obama has done? It's too cheap to just have a bad situation and say Obama should have done better.
Right. Well, I think that's a great point, and one that doesn't seem to come up a lot. Why? Just a slight tangent here, but and it's a rhetorical question, I'm afraid. But why? Oh, why don't we have a better press corps? Why aren't people forcing these questions to say no? But excuse me, sir. Or ma'am, you just said you don't like the way Obama is managing this crisis. You're just saying he's mismanaged the struggle against ISIS. What would you do differently? Why doesn't that question seem to ever get asked? Or if it is asked, and you get Gardner's hilarious, circuitous non-answer that you quoted, why don't you say you didn't answer the question? What would you do differently?
Yeah, follow-up questions are one of the most underused things by our press corps. You have to follow up and really press them on it. Overall, I think the press in this election, just to continue on the tangent, has been really disappointing. We spent the entire first half of this year certain that Obamacare would be a huge issue in the elections. It was all over. I mean, every, Morning Joe, Meet the Press, all the Beltway publications, what a disaster Obamacare was. All of a sudden, it turns around. The policy starts working as it was intended to. In fact, in some cases, better than it was intended to. The poll numbers go up. It turns out to be popular. And the press just completely dropped it. Republicans stopped talking about it entirely because it was a loser for them. And the press just kind of went along with them. They didn't say, hey, by the way, that thing you spent the whole first half of the year saying would be a disaster, it looks like it isn't now. What do you think about that? They've totally let it disappear off the radar. It's kind of crazy to watch.
Well, and how about deregulation? Hey, those deregulation policies you pushed didn't do so well. It looks like people are saying Dodd-Frank is stabilizing the economy a little bit. More may need to be done, but what do you have to say about that? They don't ask that question either. But even the obvious look, if Lindsey Graham is going around as he is saying, I forget his exact words, but oh my God, we're all going to die. Not far from what he said. They're going to kill us all, I believe. So words to that effect. And they don't say, well, then what would you do about it? If you really think, if that's not a preposterous thought to you, if you really think that they're going to come from Mosul and kill us all, what is your plan? Surely we should be mustering the entire Air Force, Army, and reinstituting the draft and everything else. What would you do? It is frustrating to me that question doesn't get asked. And obviously that's beyond our scope to discuss why, although I'm sure we both have theories. But in the couple minutes we have left, just briefly, where are we with you also noted the Brennan Center's study on dark money in this campaign, and where are we with that?
Yeah, we have already well surpassed the dark money record for the 2010 midterm elections, which is not surprising because at that point, the world of campaign finance was just starting to digest how it might be able to use Citizens United to, take advantage of the system. They've become very, very sophisticated at that now. The dark money is flowing in. One popular thing is to have what are called kind of buddy groups or buddy PACs, which are just big super PACs devoted to electing literally just one candidate. Almost everyone has one, and it's Republicans and Democrats. Mitch McConnell has one. And so these are places where they just make a total mockery of the limits. If you want to give Mitch McConnell money, you can only give him $5,200 for this cycle. But you can then turn to the Kentucky Opportunity Coalition, which is a super PAC which works literally only to elect Mitch McConnell, and you can give them $10 million, $100 million, it doesn't matter. Not only can you evade the limits, but you can keep it secret. That's a 501c4 that does not disclose donors. So it's frightening to see how fast these groups have mutated and to what extent they're apparently influencing the election.
Well, and of course, there's not much we can do about that, is there? We have a Supreme Court who says this is, what would you call it? They call it speech?
Right, exactly. And that's at the heart of it. There's a lot of good proposals out there that would sort of help around the margins, that would tamp down on some of the coordination between these buddy groups and the candidates, and that would tighten up this rule or that. But until that underlying Supreme Court logic is reversed, the system just isn't really going to get remarkably better.
Yeah, I'm amazed by logic which says that this is a form of speech which is allowed to remain completely silent, meaning that you never get to know who is speaking. And it's only speech in the form of cash. It's a fascinating, but of course, it's not logic meant to be internally consistent. I would argue it's logic meant to have a specific result. So I guess we'll close with this, George Zornick of The Nation and elsewhere. What does your gut tell you about what will happen on November 4th?
My gut tells me that Democrats will probably lose the Senate. I don't think it's as quite as for certain or doom and gloom as a lot of the pundits think, but looking at the map, it's just tough. I think, in fact, what the most likely scenario is, and you want to talk about dark money, is that either Georgia or Louisiana or both are going to go into a runoff, and you're going to have either a one-state or a two-state election, literally for control of the Senate. And you will just see you'll see dump trucks of money driving over the state line into Georgia to try to influence that race, which will happen in early December. That is really going to be a wild and hairy time if it happens.
That's an interesting and frightening scenario. The devil went down to Georgia. He was looking for some souls to buy. Um, and I have to say, it sounds highly plausible to me. Well, we'll be watching. I know you will be too. And we look forward to reading more from you and hopefully having you back on the show. RJ Zornick of The Nation, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me. Anytime.
We will be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero.